Hello and welcome to the Approach Angle podcast, a Pitcher List podcast dedicated to teaching you all things fantasy baseball and baseball analytics. I'm your host, Nate Schwartz, senior analyst at Pitcher List, and joined with me today is Kyle Bland, director of data analytics and research at Pitcher List. And we do have a guest here with us on episode 2, Alexander Chase, esteemed educator, former Pitcher List writer, and part of an older Pitcher List pod, Dugout Study Hall. He'll also be joining us today to talk about our big topic, auction calculators, draft grades, and everything else that comes along with the preseason and draft prep. So, guys, how's it going?
It's good. Happy to see y'all. Glad to kind of get the wheels churning on this podcast, really start getting into our spring training, and then eventually, hit the ground running, be ready for the season ahead.
Yeah, they say it's spring training for everyone. I literally pulled my podcast mic out of a box where it had been packed for a couple of years while I was busy being a student myself. So yeah, no longer in law school, mercifully. Mic is out of retirement, and I'm ready to do anything other than be a lawyer for the moment.
Yeah, I mean, I really, I feel all of that today. I think I had 3 slow drafts start at within an hour of one another. And it really hit me that, we are in fantasy baseball season. We're in baseball season generally. And, we come up for air in November. So really the point of this, both of these guys, really know the numbers, really know that what the preseason numbers look like. But I want to start this discussion with kind of the 2-pronged approach of how, someone might, build a ranking set or see rankings, anywhere on the internet. You'll have your more nuanced analyst rankings. Those can be from anyone, here at Pitcher List, someone's top 10 first baseman for the year, or you'll see something like auction values, and you'll hear it a lot on different podcasts and stuff like that, where dollar amounts will be discussed. So before we really get into the nitty gritty here, I want to ask you both, as 2 numbers heavy people, how do you weigh kind of industry rankings that you might read versus auction values and projections?
Go for it, Alex. You could lead us off.
Okay. So as someone who is way too in the weeds on auctiony stuff, I should say it's a starting point, but it is never absolutely determining how I am doing anything. It is the season where people tell you what they're doing in TGFBI. I'm sorry, I'm going to do that myself here. But, as I'm going down my queue that I've set, I've imported all of my ranks based off my own calculator I've made. But I am ignoring it often whenever there's a guy that Nick likes. Quite frankly, I drafted Joe Ryan well ahead of where my imported queued ranks said that I should, but also I got a deal on him at ADP, and I like him, because someone like Nick has talked me into liking him. The projection seems a little bit low. I see the upside case, but I'm using the tool that I have at my disposal to ground myself in what I expect, and then if I think it's wrong, I'm moving things up and down from there. I know numbers lie. I've talked plenty about that. I'm not going to let them lie to me in the draft room.
I'm gonna let them lie in a way that I want to be lied to. Is actually how it's gonna work out. Yeah. No, I completely agree. Baseline is the projections. However you want to orient them, and you just fold in other information from there. I've been doing a lot of preseason analysis with some fun new models and cards, and so there's still a lot of noise in spring training, but you get some signal every now and then. And so if a guy pops up like Luis Heel looked really good today, that maybe that's someone okay, I'll bookmark basically for that back end of your draft, just throw the projections out, and you want to throw some darts, and you get guys like that. Or if there's a notable swing speed change, a pitch mix change where a guy's really featuring a pitch and not just throwing 1 or 2 in an appearance, those can really bump it up. Or something that kind of all projection systems by design struggle with is risk and upside values. And so as you're going through your draft, I'll start to weigh more of okay, I feel like I have a stable group of players. Maybe I drafted a Logan Webb, and so I feel like I have okay, I've got some stable innings banked up. Maybe I'll take a swing on like a Zach Wheeler a little bit above ADP, where it's like, okay, that's a big playing time risk, but if he hits, it'll really pay off for me handsomely. So that, that's projections do the best they can, but they're trying to take so much information and consolidate it down to like a single number. And you really need to kind of apply your own formula, your own honestly like vibes, and whether that's you internally, whether that's incorporating analysis, like we have all of our staff at Pitcher List. I especially for like closers, I'm constantly looking at Rick Graham's ranks just to see like, is this guy closing, or his most recent version of the closer list has like percent of saves were for committees. And so I'm like, oh, if there's a 50-50 toss up, I'll wait for the second guy and draft him instead. Like that, you start to get like that kind of idea. And so, again, like it's good to have a baseline, a project, like a strategy. Go into it with like, this is what my approach is. This is where I'm starting from. And then you have to just vibe from there. You have to roll with the punches, go with it.
Yeah, I find it, very interesting from two guys who are as numbers and math focused as I know of fantasy baseball players and analysts, to hear we have to use vibes, is, I think, very funny, but also very important, right? I think there's a lot of discourse, whether it be fantasy baseball or, baseball as a whole, that people can get annoyed about how often analysis currently gets drilled down to one specific number. And while that one number can be very insightful and guide you, 85, 90% of the way there, there's still a lot of other things you have to be monitoring and paying attention for. Like if you notice something, you were breaking down a player, you were looking at their Pitcher List player page or, Fangraphs, whatever, and you see something that stands out and you don't think projections are capturing that, you should absolutely be writing that down and using that. There's no reason to trust that number that's trying to do 1,000 things, as Kyle said. You might be able to find an advantage that gives you that leg up to go draft a player 2 rounds earlier than they are supposed to, or stuff like that. So before we get kind of into the auction values specifically, I want to kind of go back here to show you kind of where auction values came from generally. They were part of the first version of fantasy baseball as we know it in the 70s and 80s. They came along with the creation of rotisserie fantasy baseball, not named for anything other than the restaurant at which it was first drafted at. And there was no mathematical formulas to it. It was really people were bidding, whatever they felt was necessary within that standard $260 budget. It was purely vibes, and that's how the draft went. It wasn't really until the late 1990s and early 2000s where these written things in the public sphere were put out there rather, that really documented what a calculated auction value should look like. And today, kind of as we know them, they are the Z-score for each category based on a projection system that all get compiled into one number and then scaled up into a specific dollar amount for easier comparison of players, player types, batters, pitchers, you name it. So while it goes back a long way, we are still seeing that it has a lot of utility today, and that number isn't necessarily what it started out to be, but what it is today is very, very important to how we value players and how we use projections. So I want to give you guys, or rather ask you guys, to give a little brief rundown on the two basic methods of valuing players. I mentioned the Z-scores that go into the auction values, but there's also another one, SGP, which is better known as standings gained points. So Kyle, do you want to start and kind of explain to the audience what Z-scores are and how Fangraphs uses them?
Yeah, so Z-score valuation is basically you're taking every category that's part of your specific league format. So usually your traditional 5x5 is going to be runs, RBI, homers, stolen bases, batting average for hitters. And then for pitchers, it's going to be strikeouts, wins, saves, ERA, and whip. And so for each of those categories individually, you take what a player is projected to do you subtract out the average across all draftable players for what they are projected to do, and then you divide by the standard deviation of what all of those players are projected to do. And that basically gives you an idea of, in this stat, this player is this many standard deviations better or worse than an average player. And what that does is you're scaling now all of these disparate numbers of, a guy gets 120 RBI, and that's 15 more than this other player, but that other player has 3 more stolen bases. Well, if it's, 25 versus 22 stolen bases, like how equal are those gaps? Like, is it worth it? Is one worth way more than the other? The Z-scores help kind of standardize that scale and allow you to combine all of them so that there's a uniform, this player is this better at all of these categories, and you can then combine them. Once you have those combined numbers, you can then basically convert that into a dollar value, again, based on your league settings. So how much you have to bid, how many teams and players there are, and how many, like what your like minimum bid is if you have one. And so that's how you get to your kind of dollar value from projections in a Z-score method. Standing gains points is, you take information about the league or about like that genre of league, and you learn, okay, how many, like what increment of this stat does it take to move up one place in the standings? So how much does it cost to go from the 10th best to the 11th best in runs, in homers, in RBI, in strikeouts, in wins? And that you then can compare, okay, this guy has this many more strikeouts than this other pitcher, but the other one has more wins. Well, these strikeouts are worth more points in the strikeout standings than the wins were worth in the wins standings. And so that's how it standardizes it, that instead of being standard deviations from average, you're looking at basically how many points, how many ranks in the standings am I gaining across all of our categories? And then you apply the dollar values from there. I know for our internal PLV auction calculator, in our live draft assistant, we do the Z-score method. We do some tweaks for rate stats, so like your average on base percentage, ERA, WHIP, because you'll get players like a reliever. They'll have a WHIP under 3 and it looks super elite, but it's only for 60 innings. And a starter with a WHIP of maybe a 3.7, 3.6 might actually boost your ERA, roughly similarly to what that reliever would do. Yeah, Alex, what do you have? You have thoughts on the matter?
Oh no, I was just trying to imagine how elite a player with a whip of 3 would actually be. You're all
Oh,
good
is
there.
it?
I think
ERA.
we caught you
My
what you
bad.
meant.
Yeah. ERA. That's on me. Yeah, a whip of 3 is, he's not going to do much damage because he's going to be out of the league in, I don't know, 3 games. But yeah, an ERA, I said. So that it helps you kind of evaluate a rate stat and convert it into kind of a volume metric. So the way we tend to do that is for something like average, is it will be like, how many hits does this player add to your team? And then you can compare that across various players of, okay, well, he has this many at bats for this average. Same thing of like, this guy has much more volume, but his average is worse. But it's actually better for you in the long run, even though his average looks worse, because he's doing it over a bigger sample that helps your team more. So there are, even within kind of those two broader frameworks, there's a lot of nuance that can go into it. And I know, like, we'll talk a little bit more about replacement level, filling in for like injured players and things like that. And those will all also kind of inform these two valuation systems, but that's kind of a higher level breakdown of what those look like.
And I think the really informative overarching explanation of the two biggest ways that you can kind of go about creating dollar values outside of purely vibes, which I know some people have tried to draft with before, and it's always an interesting time. But
I like
really
drafting with those people.
yeah,
I
as
love
long
a
as
good
I
vibes
have
drafter.
yeah. But I think for someone who really wants to get into this, I think kind of the question that I'll ask Alex here is, what really matters in making, is one more accurate than another? And, how do you kind of understand which one is, more accurate than one?
So I think the thing that people overestimate is the degree to which being tailored to your league and your league mates and getting like that standings based approach actually equates to better results going forward. If you're someone who's read the process and has strong feelings about this, you know, argue with me online, I guess. But my feeling about this, generally speaking, is that it does not make sense to equate your league mates' bad decisions in July to your draft decisions in March. Trying to equate standings to draft capital is just making apples to oranges comparisons as far as I see it. Now, I think people have great, great and replicable results when they use it because they're also making great and replicable decisions during the seasons about how they manage their teams. I simply put, do not trust the standings based approach. I also just don't think that anyone who's like having this discussion about how you should make that happen on that level is going to be losing their league because of that decision. Generally speaking, if you're the point where you care that much and where you're
Mhm.
going to be analyzing how much a player adds to your team on a granular level, you're going to be winning some other battles as well. So like in terms of the discussion we're having here, if you have developed opinions about that and you disagree with me about that, I guarantee you there's probably something I'm going to be able to learn along the way from that discussion, or because you're probably doing something else really well. For those of y'all who are not making your own calculators and just want to know what the takeaways of all this, know what you're supposed to trust, I want to say that fight is extremely low on my list. Um, I I don't think that I really care all that much about how we're doing that side of things, relatively speaking, because they both share the same fundamental procedural flaw as I see it, as we'll get into it. Someone who played with these things for like 6 or 7 years now, and the closer I've looked into the black box, the less I trust it. Is probably a good way to say it. Um, they both share the same fundamental flaw of just evaluating end of season projections. They do not care whether a player gets there in 160, 140, or 100 games. And that I think you'll hear a lot of people all season talk about is the most difficult thing. I think the way that we incorporate our understanding that playing time projections are flawed is the big challenge that we'd like to be able to address today. But really, just the long and short of this is that a lot of a lot of auction calculators end up just being playing time output machines. And it's our job today and for the rest of draft season to get ourselves out of the trusting more games equals more value mindset that these things put us into, wittingly or unwittingly. So, I'm sure y'all have made some decisions this draft season based off of, who is or isn't going to have a job. But I hope you're not just seeing, 159 games played means better and drafting someone, because that is, I think, the core thing we're trying to avoid.
Yeah,
Yeah,
absolutely.
so I
As someone who does projections, it is like the name of the game is if you get playing time right, you have the best projections, like bar none. Like that's just how it is. Like rate stats will be good if, it's nice if your rate stats are good, but like if you're, if a guy gets injured and you were 10 games closer to what his end of season actually looked like, yours are just going to be better. Like that's how it works. I think another component too of this is if you are an active manager or you are someone who pays attention and are willing to like put the work in, do like whether it's trades in season or you're very active on the waiver wire, I think that's when you start folding in that replacement value. If you're a manager where you're not going to be paying a lot of attention or you're just kind of like, yeah, if you're in it for fun, take your auction calculators, run with it. Like it's going to be great. You're probably still going to be better off than most of your league mates anyway. But yeah, that there is a like if you want to be more invested, then yeah, you can start to fold in replacement playing time and just be like, oh well, he's going to be hurt for 30 games. I can fill that, and I can fill that with a quality player and not just some schmuck kind of thing. Like I'm confident in myself to do that kind of thing.
yeah, I think obviously it depends on the what the player is, and I think one of the things we hear a lot from Nick when he talks about pitchers, now and then in the first couple of weeks of April is, things are quickly changing. and all it takes is 1 or 2 outings for someone to display something that would completely change his, full season projection. And that obviously isn't reflected. If you're willing to be agile, some of these full season things aren't worth following. But I do want to kind of follow up with you, Kyle, as the creator of a very good projection system. Someone goes on to either the Pitcher List live draft assistant, or they go into the Fangraphs auction calculator page. Does the source of projections really matter that much? Are there any like significant differences that you would call out immediately when someone is looking to build something like that? And does that really change, meaningfully change what a dollar value looks like, or is it generally kind of noise, across the line?
I think there's a lot of really good projection systems out from a lot of people that I really respect. And I think it's very important to understand how they're coming about their projections. So for someone like Jordan Rosenblum's Oopsie projections, that incorporates a lot of like very cutting edge kind of stats of he had bat speed when we only had a year of it, that he was incorporating it in a way that he was comfortable with. And I'm sure he researched very well. And so like that was basically like, okay, it's going to take some bigger swings because this is new data that isn't maybe back tested quite as much. But I'm like, that is kind of the risk reward projection system that I've really liked. And he also incorporated stuff, the Fangraph Stuff Plus. He's worked with Eno Saris to kind of make that sing a little bit on the pitcher side too. I know Derek Carty with the bat, and now the Bat X, which is for hitters and pitchers now, that he's done a lot of really good work, especially incorporating a lot of, baseball savant metrics like barrel rate, all that good stuff. But now on the pitcher side, he's also incorporating his own stuff model. And then you have kind of tried and true like Steamer, Zips, like classic projections. And they're, year in, year out, they're extremely good at what they do. They're always towards the top. Sometimes they might not be the most accurate, but they're always going to be competitive. And then you also have something like Ariel Cohen's ATC projections, which that's an aggregation. So aggregated projections are generally going to be the most accurate. They're also probably going to be the most consensus. So you'll see if you're drafting with those kind of consensus based rankings, you're probably going to end up getting sniped a lot. You're going to have a lot of similar evaluations, a lot of other people who are probably doing a lot of other similar things, versus if you're using kind of an originated projection, like ours at Pitcher List, where we incorporate our PLV pitch model and its derivative hitter stats, where we derive like the hitter's ability to add power, contact, and make good decisions based on those model values. That is a very unique originated projection base. So we tend to have guys that we like to plant flags on, that we trust some stats sooner than others, or we believe in maybe a guy's underlying talent more than what his results showed. So I think like if you're using a projection system, you're already got a leg up on a lot of people. I think the choice in projections can come down to preference of, again, like if you're confident managing in season, you could probably take a riskier originated projection where you're like, okay, I'm going to plant my flag on these guys. And if it works out, I hit a home run. If it doesn't work out, I can manage it in season. Or you can use, the aggregated one if you're comfortable balancing. A lot of other people will probably be drafting off something similar. And so it's going to be a lot more competitive in draft for you. And you're not going to get your guys, I would say, as much with a projection system like that.
I should note, there's been a lot of work to try to compare which are and aren't accurate in different ways. And I talked earlier about these things being playing time machines. The long and short of it is that they're all really good at projecting talent. And the incremental gains you make there are really, really tough to make. If you are plugging this stuff into a calculator, the way that they like approach playing time as as an endeavor really does reflect how useful they are, or really translates directly to how useful they are. And I think a lot of people's expectations or understandings of how useful these things are as draft tools end up just being about that approach, and not even that they evaluate players correctly. So ATC takes that sort of consensus approach on playing time as well. And that means that players end up projected for about 145 games really, really consistently. And the differences in evals through ATC end up being more about trying to project talent. But the other thing is, if you're using Zips and Zips is going to take the wild swings, they think that someone's going to get sent down or not play, and they'll slap an 80 game projection or a 100 game projection on some of these more injury prone players. Like, suddenly that guy's just entirely off your board. And I think this is a good time to kind of talk about why, when I say that I looked into the black box and I didn't like what I found, like the particular thing I'm looking at. If any of y'all were in Algebra 1 at any point in your lives, I'm going to say some words that might have scared you then and afterwards, but I promise you this is not that difficult. We were talking about either standing games points or z-scores. It's fundamentally just input of home runs multiplied by some number gets you an output. But in order for anyone to have a draft value below 0 or approaching 0, you've got to have like a starting point, right? If you're using, the Fangraphs auction calculator in a rather standard 12-ish team setting with, like a $10 per player, $260 total setup, somewhere in that range. The average player, if they play like one game and then get hurt, at the end of the year, they'll have like a negative $50 total. Now, that sounds ridiculous because that's not how things work, but that is how the math works. The y equals mx plus b, the b in there, the y-intercept, the starting amount at the beginning of the season is negative $50 for a lot of these end of season projections. And as you earn your way back up, you cross that threshold. I remember in 2022, was it 2021? I'm not an Atlanta Braves fan, so I can't remember which one it was where Ronald Acuna Jr. Blew up his D in the middle of the year. I charted at one point to figure out exactly when he crossed that threshold, and he was like a $5 player in like 80 games. That did not mean that if he had played 160 games, he would have been a $10 player. He made up like $50 worth of value in the first 80 games. He would have been like a $60-ish player. I can't remember the exact rate, but like the point is that as you add 10 more games onto a lot of these players' projections, it's not that their value will go up, like a couple percent. It'll double in some cases. And that's why something like ATC tends to do really, really well in Ariel Cohen's like game theory thing, is that he's applying this, tiny increments in playing time get you closer. He ends up being on the right side of the post a lot of times, and you end up drafting the right players. It doesn't make his projections more accurate. It just means that if you are using the flawed approach that everyone uses, that his setup is best tailored to it. And that something like Zips is terribly tailored to it. But just want to say, Dan Szymborski, if you see a WRC plus that Zips spits out that like is really favorable for your player, don't be surprised if the other indicators in its favor are also some of the more cutting edge stuff. And then maybe some of the more traditional tools like Steamer might be out on a guy. Though when I see that setup, that is a really nice sign that I'm onto a guy that I like, and I got to figure out how to make the playing time work usually.
Yeah, I think at least for me, when I'm looking at either projections or kind of doing my own, calculations in my draft process, one of the big things I like to do is take all of the stats that, I end up aggregating a handful of projections, not using ATC, but I'll use pitcher list projections along with a few other things. But then I'll turn that down into rate stats for everything else. So then I can play with the playing time on my own, because I, as you guys will all learn on this podcast, I'm a delirious Cardinals fan who, for better or worse, knows too much about the St. Louis Cardinals. But I've been pretty confident that JJ Weatherholt's breaking camp with the Cardinals, through and through. And, I don't think projection systems are adequately adjusting for that. And, if I bump that up a little bit, I can see how that changes. And while obviously I'm not going to, I know some people do that on a full case-by-case basis. I think Justin Mason maybe projects, playing time by hand for everyone, which is, an insane ask to do. But if I'm in a position where everything's kind of as is, and, I heard a nugget about a player, and this is kind of the vibes, Taylor, that you're putting on, what you're looking at, that gives you the advantage to say, well, I'm valuing this guy way more than everyone else is, and I'm going to draft him at my cost rather than, play to the whims of what the draft might do. But I do want to transition here a little bit and get into league format. One of the things that's integral to any of the auction calculators or auction values that you might see is that league format. I know there's a lot of articles that will put, dollar signs next to a player in their rankings. But I want to ask you, Kyle, why is league format so important, and how does it, really drive why values may differ from league to league?
Yeah, I mean, a lot, the vast majority of fantasy baseball is going to hover around that standard 5x5 categories that I mentioned earlier. Um, uh, Generally, leagues are going to be 12 to 15. Sometimes you'll get shallower at 10. Sometimes, I've heard leagues that get as deep as like 30, like basically like replicating baseball, but it's probably broadly going to be 12 to 15 teams. So there's a lot of like rough similarities there. But then if you start to think about something like some leagues have 3 outfielders versus some leagues have 5 outfielders. And when you're getting into like a 10 team league that has 3 outfielders, you think about it from like a Major League Baseball standpoint. That's 1 outfielder per team. Like you're basically getting every team's best outfielder is going to get drafted, and that's the end of it. If you're looking at 5 outfielders a team and it's a 15 team league, well, suddenly you're at 75 outfielders. Now you're getting 2.5 outfielders from each team, so that there's only going to be 15 starting spots that aren't on your starting lineup as your fantasy team. So that there's going to be, you're really scraping the bottom of the barrel once you get to the end of that. Or God help you if you're in a multi-catcher league where that second catcher value starts to really, really take a hit. The top guys are great. In a one catcher league, I think it's actually a really great year for that. But once you start delving into that, okay, I need to have a second catcher. That's a place where it's not even like, is he getting platooned or not? That teams are just understand the wear and tear that catching does, and will just split responsibilities for health reasons. And so that really bumps up guys who will just get plate appearances, whether it's a guy like Cal Raleigh, who's just going to be an Ironman behind the plate, whether it's a guy like Sal Perez, who's going to combo catch and DH. That playing time really starts to add up. And that's just in the structure of what your league looks like. Once you start getting into what different categories are, that really starts to highlight differences between players. And I really like the weirder leagues because that's where you can really like make hay. That once you get like really obscure settings, that's where you get kind of maybe underpriced player archetypes, that you can really start to lean into. Your 3 true outcomes slugger gets really highly valued in an OBP league. I know in my home league, which is OBP, I had Joey Gallo just every year just because he was an OBP cheat code, like just dingers and walks all the time, or at least in the projections, sometimes better than others. But it's also important too if you're in like a quality start league that like a guy like a Logan Webb or a Chris Sanchez that is going to be allowed to go deep into games, even if they have ratios that might not be great or strikeout rates that maybe aren't quite as elite. They have a really high innings and quality start per start ceiling. Yeah, what's up, Alex?
Yeah, that exact thing. I feel like is something that people who make these things have trouble with, and I really want to make sure to kind of like hammer on that point. Whether or not your league is like per start for pitchers or like an innings cap league will massively change basically like what the scarcity constraint is for these things. And if you're dealing with these calculators, that is a thing to be wary of in terms of knowing how the numbers are going to be wrong and being able to play around it. If so, are you someone who, like me, has dabbled in some shares of Logan Webb in the right places? You are,
Oh,
right?
absolutely.
Yeah.
I'm a big Logan Webb stan, especially after his strikeout rate bump last year, which seems pretty legit.
Right. Yeah. He's someone who, in certain leagues, I got a ton of shares of. Same with Framber does. Those are the sorts of
Mhm.
guys that, in certain setups, are massively undervalued, and those setups are always going to be situations where you have like a weekly constraint of some sort. If you can get to let's call it 35 instead of 30 innings combined. I know the numbers are higher, but right, like a handful of extra innings matters. Those guys are massively undervalued. The K rate looks bad, but like the K per start's actually good. If you play in any sort of dynasty or roto setup that has an innings pitch capped in the season in the league, like everything effectively turns into a K per 9 league, and that's an entirely different stat. And so if you just clicked the K button in your auction calculator, you're like measuring the wrong outcome. And like there's not a wins per 9 button that you can click in a lot of these calculators. I mean, I built one in for like the one I do homebrew because I want to try to beat Kyle and Nate eventually in our leagues. It is weird that I am separately in a different dynasty league with each of y'all. And I will leave to the listeners to guess which one has consistently beaten me and which one has consistently not beaten me. But I definitely have built those tools in because I know that if you're trying to get accurate values for these guys, the edge cases are where you make your hay, and you've got to be able to treat them correctly. If you're not making your own, you just have to know that that's a mental adjustment that you have to make. And so people like Nick who are trying to create ranks generally are trying to adjust for some of these things. I always bug him about random folks about whether he's under or overrating them on those things, but like ultimately you've got an impossible job whenever you're trying to create a one number approach, a one tier approach evenly. And so I kind of appreciate that he tends to bucket guys of similar like sorts of archetypes, and then you just move those entire archetypes up or down depending on your format. In any league like TGFBI, I definitely feel like though you gotta have a guy like Logan Webb, someone in your staff, because ultimately a couple more innings matter a lot. So I just want to say, like, we're going to talk about different ways that things can change. That I think is the most obvious takeaway for how people's formats change in like a stealth way. It's not even changing categories, but ultimately it is changing categories in a way. You move from K to K per 9, win to win per 9 in a lot of these setups without realizing it.
Yeah, it pivots you from
so
volume to like talent, basically.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, so on your comment about, making a mental note about what evaluation should be, say you're someone who has set up they've found their projection system, they set up an auction calculator, mimicking what their format is, and it looks good, but then they throw everyone into a list, and you'll see something like relievers are ridiculously high. How do you guys both A, value relievers, but then B, kind of make that mental note, whether it's, relievers in a system or catchers can often be overvalued, within a positional tier, to understand, what might be their true value despite what, the dollar sign in your sheet is going to be telling you in a draft?
Yeah, so I'll kind of jump on that first, especially with relievers, that it's such a stark difference for leagues that have ratio stats. Kind of like I alluded to earlier, just being able to understand like how you properly weight a rate stat in terms of how it helps your team. Like you can't just be like, okay, like this ERA is this good, I'm going to multiply it by this many innings, blah 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 blah. Like you need to kind of understand what ERA is at a team level. Is you're just taking your earned runs from your whole team over your innings pitched for your whole team. And so then functionally what it comes down to is who's helping you be most efficient with those earned runs. And you can look at it per spot of like, okay, a pitcher spot is going to allow this many runs in this many innings. If I take a reliever, I'm, shaving off this many earned runs, but I'm also shaving off this many innings. And then you can apply that to, depending on how specific you want to be, you can apply it to like a general team of you just take assume the rest of your team is an average pitcher. And you can see like, okay, this is how this pitcher affects a team of average pitchers. Or, if you want to get really granular with it, you can have your already drafted positions that you can be like, okay, this pitcher influences my team in this specific way, and that can kind of change dynamically as your draft goes along. And so just understanding that will give you very different values rather than just a straight Z score where the relievers are going to be sick by, the rate stats, and you just assume, oh, well, they're going to have fewer strikeouts and wins, so that'll kind of even out. Like, no, that's not the case. And so you can kind of see auction calculators that might not take that step can really bump up relievers in that way.
I have talked with a handful of other folks. Rudy Gamble at Rasball, they run an SGP, standing GPS, sort of system, and I've chatted with him online a handful of times over the years about the difficulties of building a setup for relievers that like mirrors how we play. And the problem at the end of the day is we are drafting, and that is an entirely separate thing. You're acquiring player capital, or however you want to put it, and that's separate from setting your lineups. Closers blow up, and you do not keep them in your lineup. If you think that Estevez in Kansas City is going to be out of his job quickly, but you think you get 5 saves ahead of time, you replace him in your lineup with someone else, whoever else is going to win that battle down the line. I'm not getting involved in that set of shares personally, but like, if you are worried about, I don't know, someone losing their job and you're trying to project that, that's an entirely separate thing from someone losing their job and you trying to acquire the solutions there. So I don't know who you think Nate is going to be the closer in St. Louis. Probably though, it's one after another, right? Isn't the theory that like they juice Jojo Romero's trade value and then get him out of there, and then do I have it backwards?
Is it O'Brien?
So O'Brien is hurt with a calf injury right now. I think he gets the first shot. I don't know how much of a shot Romero is going to get, but the sleeper option that I've been kind of eyeing here is Ryan Stanek. He's the one veteran in that bullpen. He's been sitting 100 in spring training. Talk about a guy who you could pump 2.5 months of saves out of and then ship him off at the deadline. That seems like a really good option. So I would pencil him in as a sleeper candidate to get that role.
I knew I could trust you for exactly that. That's the sort of thing where when you are trying to draft, you are probably going to be using projections that are assuming that someone's going to get traded into a non-closer role, and that's just not going to lead to an accurate per week valuation for while you are using someone. So for relievers, I like to figure out, roughly speaking, where like my model would tell me someone is going to go based off of some of these things. I throw it out the window. Like, I'm going to refresh it after draft season ends. I had some like moderate epiphanies about how I could be doing per week values differently. I'm going to try something out. I did it for some points leagues. It seems like it may have worked. It may not have worked. We'll see. But, by my numbers, the people who were underrated were still just the people I targeted. And that was more my approach than anything. Palencia was showing up as a guy who was a relative value. In my system, actually, the way I'd built things, relievers were do not draft guys. I over adjusted basically, I think. And this is even after I put like saves at like a 1.25 value. Still, my like per started like approach was leaving me without having drafted any closers if I just agreed with it. So I saw that Palencia is a relative value. I saw that Garcia in Texas was a relative value. And I kind of just disagreed with a couple of evals out of the system I was using. I'm an oopsie guy, mostly because I can bug Jordan and figure out how his system works. And also it means that I'm not using the same setup as literally everyone else in my pitcherless focus leagues who are using the PL tools. But, I thought that his eval on Fairbanks in Miami wasn't quite right because it used all of his data from last season, and he introduced a new pitch midseason, looked a lot better. And, so it's like, hey, he's relatively valuable. He seems like he's good at slot. Those are people I went after. I'm just never blindly trusting those numbers though, and like saying that like I do or do not need to draft someone because they were like $1 or $2 away from the consensus value for a pick. Like, I've got to get closers eventually. Pull the trigger on the guy that like seems like he's a relative value, and you're probably in a good spot. Don't overthink it. That's the best advice I can give, because that's the only advice that I can possibly live by.
Yeah. So, I mean, very good advice. But I want to move on a little bit here, just kind of expanding outside of relievers. One of the things, once you get, we could talk about relievers for forever, but I think that's probably a job for Rick Graham and Jake Crumpler in the pen. But one of the things in the middle of the draft, as guys start to move off your board, you'll notice that there start to be some emerging gaps on what, your values might say a player is worth versus their ADP. And, how is the market developing? Has there been an earlier run on second baseman than anticipated? Or, are there more starters on the board than you really thought there would be at this point? How do you use your values in a draft as an anchor without either missing out on good value or, being too ambitious?
Yeah, I'll take a start. So that's one of the things I love about auction calculators is they kind of by design make their own tiers. So that it's not just, okay, I have this guy ranked 12th, this guy ranked 13th, that they may be functionally identical or they may have a multi-dollar difference. And as you get later in the draft, those differences get smaller, but it's still really helpful to understand kind of gaps between them, or especially if you're looking within a player position. Like, okay, there's a drop here that like maybe ADP doesn't cover it, or maybe like this guy's undervalued, but like this is where the cliff is and I want the last guy before the cliff. And so that's usually what I'll come down to is I'm generally not too worried about runs. That might just be overconfidence in thinking that like look at all these dummies drafting all these. Do they know? Do they know? But actually like okay, if there's one pitcher I like this, or a second baseman that I'll make sure to be like, okay, if I start to see that wall, that cliff coming, I'm going to make sure to grab this guy. Otherwise, if we're kind of in the middle of it, or if it's only like one or two guys, I'm not too concerned. I'm happy to just wait, take whatever values are there for me when my turn's up, and then kind of get my guy who I think is value later on.
Yeah, I think the risk that people run whenever they see that someone has a huge value relative to ADP is missing that like you can probably find other values elsewhere, and it's your job to figure out where the best time to sink like your one shot on a first baseman or a catcher is. So this year, Cal Raleigh is projected really well. And if you're playing in a two catcher league or in a deep one catcher league or in a league with weekly lineups where you can't like stream catchers, like Cal Raleigh is a great player to have on your team. But people everywhere don't understand how valuable like good catchers are in a lot of these formats. And so he is not the only good catcher that you have to like consider. And so if you go down the tiers, you get the third or fourth best catcher. That guy is also undervalued, right? That sort of choice is, I think, fundamentally like just as important as like okay, I'm really, really into the projection for Jake Berger. Do I take Jake Berger at pick 175 or pick 275 if they're all relatively? Why am I thinking about Jake Berger? Well, I mean, he's going to hit 25 home runs again, right? But like that sort of decision is like just as important as like early on. You have to figure out can you just wait and get another guy who's valuable later on? It's instead of like a different guy, it's do I continue to bleed my cheat code that people don't know about? And I tend to take the approach that I have to be very confident that my guy won't go if I think he's the best player on the board. And if I don't think someone's the best player on the board and they're like one of three guys that I have, up there, or if it's close, I will definitely let that guy run and risk like losing it. Just because, one, there's a good chance that if I'm that far off consensus, I'm probably wrong about something. Two, like in a lot of these cases, it means you're not missing that much. But I intentionally let first base run in a couple leagues this year because I liked my elite first base options. And when people talk about runs on a position happening, I just want to point out, as always, your 15th, 16th, 17th, 18th round pick, those guys are in your lineup. If you don't get an elite first baseman, you can get an elite outfielder and just wait and fill your lineup later. It bugs me to no end when people are like, okay, I see the cliff on second base. I gotta get a guy here, and I'm willing to push up. People do this with third baseman. I just think aren't that good. Like people are drafting Alex Bregman really high. I don't get it. I think they're panicking. Like you can have a bad third baseman and still have a good team. You don't need to pay extra for a mid for third baseman and then have a bad team. So, those sorts of choices are fundamentally what I'm doing at each step. I am not concerned about the sort of like, I have to get a guy at a tier. I am just pick by pick. Am I taking my shot on a guy who I think is good value here? And I'm living with whatever comes after that.
Yeah, I think that is kind of, a really good guide to follow in terms of what your mindset needs to be as you get, into the middle rounds, into the late rounds. And as we talked about earlier, where this playing time can be such a fickle thing and ability, maybe the values don't line up with what you see the ability as being, and you can take a shot even if your sheet isn't telling you to do so. But because we are running a little bit long here, I want to transition into one final topic that I know both people on here have a lot of thoughts about, and that's draft grades. One of the great things, when you finish a draft, you've been sitting there for 2.5 or 3 hours, you hit close, and whatever platform you're on, it tells you that you're projected to finish first, and you're feeling great. You're like, oh, I won the draft. This season is going to be easy. Blah blah blah. So I will start with Alex. How do you feel about draft grades? And I will ask a leading question here. Why are they meaningless?
If I have anything B+ or better, I know I've done a bad job. It's kind of how I feel about a lot of these things. I mean, they're just counting up your stats. Like, they don't even make distinctions about positions in a lot of cases. It's just like whoever's got the most home runs comes first. That's not how lineups work. And like, I am obsessed about playing time in a lot of different ways, but like, ultimately, you win your league by setting your lineups. You lose your draft and get a good draft grade in the process by paying extra as if you're not going to set your lineups. So if you've gone through and drafted guys like, for example, Marcus Semien this year, according to Steamer, is projected for like 155 games. And then someone like Otto Lopez is also by Steamer projected for like 117 games. They are both going to start every day. They're both good defenders. They're both eligible at second base. They're both going in similar places. If your draft grade is based on, the fact that Marcus Semien was projected for more games played, and you just drafted all those guys over and over again, instead of paying attention to, is this guy projected to start? Is he good? And just making those smart decisions along the way, like, you're going to end up with a really good draft grade and a bad team in a lot of cases if you don't go into this with the right mindset. So I think typically whenever I have done well in a league, it has been because I have made those aggressive choices at the end of drafts to take up guys who suddenly have a job that they weren't projected to have and things like that. And that will just give you a bad grade. And it's the Weather Holt thing. It's the Otto Lopez thing. It's a lot of pitchers who are like on the far fringes. Mick Abel is a guy on my board who is just not going to be projected for that many innings. He looks nasty. Like, that's how you win. Your draft grade won't reflect that.
Yeah, I agree. I mean, if you're in best ball, draft grades are great because that's the season, that's the league. Like, I get that. That's pretty much the only one where I'm like, this is reflective of how I feel I did this draft. I mean, it's also too like very different on there. It's conditional on what projections are being graded with. That if I'm using PLV and you're using Oopsie and Nate's using Steamer, that like we could all be the best drafts by our valuation system. So we probably will be, because by design we're probably getting the values that our projection systems we're using say we're getting. And so like there is a lot of that, and that's where you're starting to see a lot more tools that are kind of more like third party evaluation systems, which are nice and probably give you a better representation. But like those emails you get when your draft wraps up that's like you got an A, like I do not trust those as far as I can throw them, because we're just evaluating on kind of fundamentally different systems. I do agree with the playing time thing, that draft grades are just evaluating how many plate appearances and innings you drafted at a certain extent. That it's not talent consideration. Yeah, it's not risk reward consideration. The things I talked about with projections, like that's draft grades are, it is a necessary evil, I guess, in the way they are. Like they kind of have to do it that way. There's not really another way that makes sense for all leagues to make a comparison like that. But you're right. There's considerations of like, well, I took a rookie, like an upside rookie at the end of the draft, and If he makes it out of camp, then that's a huge win for me playing time wise. If he gets sent back down, I cut him and I get the next guy off the waiver. And like that's a huge like it's like a zero cost move that's all upside for you. And the same thing kind of with pitchers, especially because things like stuff stabilize so quickly in season and usage is also pretty. Pitchers, when the games count, will drop a pitch they don't trust very quickly. And so if you hear all of these things, oh, this guy's adding a cutter, that like, well, give me 2 games in the regular season, and if that cutter has disappeared, it's not coming back. Like once games have started, guys don't just really add pitches as the season goes along. So I think there's a lot to be said, especially at the end of your draft. Draft grades will really boost you for taking the oatmeal guys that have full-time plate appearances and just aren't worth it on a rate stats basis, and will penalize you for taking the home run swings that you should be taking there, because the opportunity cost is basically 0 if you don't hit on them. So that's like my understanding of how those draft grades, like how to interpret them. I think there's something to be said for they give you a prior that you can work from, and you can know like, okay, I'm projected for 4th, but I took some swings here, some swings there. It's like I feel confident about this. That I think that there can be actionable information to get from them, but like they are not gospel.
Yeah, I think for me at least, I mean, my Earth League, I ended up in first place in the projection standings with, whatever, a 95 grade, which is the greatest I've ever done in one of these, which frankly has me terrified. Is there any, post draft evaluation tool that you find useful? I know you kind of talked about, being in 4th and that setting you up in particular ways, but is there anything that really, calls out to either of you that's like, oh, I want to be looking at this to see, what category I might need, or what thing am I trying to overcome?
The thing that I do that is just absolutely like crazy amount of effort and that other people should not do, and then I'll give you the lower value version of this as like, is like I am evaluating the like basically per game value that a player adds multiplied by their game value, like number of games predictably played, to figure out, am I drafting people who are talented at hitting home runs, stealing bases, hitting for average as I go, and I'm tabulating that as I am drafting to figure out if I am up or down on things. And I think it is more important to have a similar sort of mental process. This guy is a plus home run guy. Guy is a double minus at batting average guy. Having a balanced sort of thing as you go, and just making sure that you've filled out your roster as you've gone with people who fit together and who also play. I think the biggest mistake you can make in a lot of these cases, especially in deeper leagues where the end of the draft is going to be full of, platoon guys, is taking a bunch of swings on guys who won't play. And because you've got a bunch of them, thinking to yourself, well, I got a lot of dirts. Well, they're still all left-handed. They're still all going to get platooned. Your draft calculator or your draft grader is still going to think you did okay because they're all predicted for like 120 games, and you're still going to miss playing time. So, try to get people who offer you good things categorically. Try to get people who will play, ignoring what the projections will say on playing times towards the end. Like, I simply do not care what Oopsie or PLV or Steamer or anyone else has to say about Connor Norby. He is a right-handed hitting third baseman who is playing every day. Like, 3 is better than 2. And those are basically the sorts of things, like if you've checked that off, if everyone in your roster is like someone you can rely on in your weekly lineups, or if you're in a daily league and you're like, you've hit those benchmarks for having enough of the platoon-ish guys that you can move around. If you've walked out with a useful lineup, you've done a good job.
Well, that really kind of wraps up our discussion about auction calculators. I know we could all talk about them kind of forever and fully eclipsing all of draft season, but I do want to call out just kind of 2 final things here in terms of new stuff out in the world in terms of baseball analytics. The first being our pitcher lists pitch cards, which were developed by Kyle himself, that seemingly everyone who follows baseball or has ever known about baseball now follows the account, but they're a really great way to to visualize the data, we've been seeing the account post all of the spring training appearances, and they will be available on publicly very shortly, which is very exciting. And then I also want to shout out that the bet tracking stats are now on Fangraphs. So continuing to really get as much of this data out there as possible. I think a lot of people like to complain about there being too much information, but even 5 years ago, there was so much less information than there is now. And I think it's a very good thing to have more out there, have more cool people, doing neat things with this data and being able to manipulate it and make it digestible for the people who may not be interested in it, and really improve how they understand baseball or get an edge in fantasy baseball. So that will wrap up this episode of the Approach Angle. Alex, do you want to plug anything in particular?
So I basically am mostly retired from writing at this point. If you were a Dugout Study Hall listener and you're wondering where we went, yeah, like I said, I went to law school and didn't have time. It turns out I probably did have more time than I thought. After about a semester or two of actually trying to read all of my stuff, I realized that I was doing just fine once in a while if I also looked at Fangraphs in class. But I'm not writing. If you want to get my opinions anywhere, join the Pitcher List Discord because I post too much there. And that is, as always, the best place to get instant analysis, reaction, and bad opinions from me. Otherwise, I'm on Blue Sky, sort of. I don't post much at Chase Rate. And if you are in the community and you like to catch up, I'd love to hear from y'all. But I'm not actively trying to get anyone to read anything I've written recently.
And I can say for all of the true Dugout Study Hall listeners from years past, which honestly is somewhat of a motivation behind the idea of this podcast, you are greatly missed in the content industry, though I do appreciate your bad takes in the Pitcher List Discord. But Kyle, what's on the plate for Pitcher List and all the stuff you're doing over the next couple of weeks before the season starts?
Yeah, so like you said, we just released these pitch cards, so it's been a lot of kind of tuning those. We've really appreciated the feedback and support we've gotten from them so far. They've been a lot of fun. I've really enjoyed seeing a lot of the responses to them. Part of that is new PLV models, and so those will be implemented into our projections shortly. So we'll have kind of our new last major revision of projections out before the season really gets into shape. And then we have our live draft system we're working on. We have our PO Pro dashboard that's going to be kind of your one-stop shop for all of our Pitcher List tools that you can use to manage your fantasy team, all of our apps, charts, everything kind of in one home to really get all of the benefits that Pitcher List has in one spot. And then again, I'm also very active in our Pitcher List Discord. I'm on Blue Sky. I have Twitter. I'm much less active on it, but yeah, reach out to me. I'm happy to talk baseball. I always have kind of a couple different ideas churning in the back of my head, so I'm liable to put some sort of new stat out on a moment's notice.
It's the wonderful thing about Kyle. There's always something churning, and we benefit more often than not with the things that go on in his head and come to fruition in terms of baseball stats. And for me, you can find me on Twitter @_Nate Schwartz and at nschwartz.bsky.app on Blue Sky. And hopefully we'll have one more episode of the Approach Angle coming out before the season starts. Hopefully maybe breaking down what those pitch cards look like, give the real ins and outs to that. And then once the season gets going, we'll really kick it off on doing deep dives on a variety of stats and things happening across baseball. But hopefully we help you out with your drafts this year, and we will see you on the next one.